All right, so we are up and running, and we are carrying on from last week's discussion. So last week we were discussing Kashrut, and we went through the basics of which animals are kosher, and we began to talk about the idea that we can't mix meat and milk. And I told you that that was something we're going to continue to work on, and that's going to be the whole start of today, because the prohibition on meat and milk becomes absolutely essential for how we organize our kitchens, because mixing meat and milk is prohibited. And when we make sure we don't, it's going to introduce a lot of different topics. So let's go ahead and get into the mix of it. As we looked at last week, this is a repeat. The idea that we do not cook a baby goat, a kid, with the milk comes up 3 times in Torah. And as we saw from Shulchan Aruch, which was, of course, confirmed from the Talmud, this is not only about goats and their specific mother's milk. This is simply a typical case that is being used as an example of a general category, which is all meat and all milk. So what does that mean? The house of Rabbi Eliezer said that you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk, right? We get that 3 times. Why did the Torah say it 3 times? 1, for the prohibition of eating. 2, for the prohibition of deriving benefit. And prohibition of cooking, right? So the Torah is not just being redundant because it likes saying the same thing over and over, but each one of those is to teach us a different level of restriction. And in particular, the idea that we're not even allowed to cook it or derive benefit from it goes above and beyond the other laws of Kashrut. For most things, we're just not allowed to eat. In many other cases, deriving benefit or even being part of cooking is not an issue as long as you're not tasting what you're cooking. That's more complicated. If you're going to be a cook in a non-kosher restaurant, we can talk. But the prohibition on meat and milk is much more extensive, right? You don't eat, you don't cook, and you don't get any benefit from it. So you couldn't mix it together and then sell it to someone else that wasn't Jewish. That's not permitted. Good?
You can't go to McDonald's and sell cheeseburgers?
So I didn't actually put this in tonight, but since you've mentioned it, there's a very interesting caveat of this, which is that the prohibition on this only kicks into effect when you are dealing with kosher meat. So if you wanted to own a McDonald's franchise in America, because they don't sell kosher meat, right? So the non-kosher meat mixed with their cheese is not violating this prohibition. Kosher before it becomes an infraction. Now, of course, you can't eat it anyway because it's non-kosher meat, but you're not violating this commandment. So as always, the rabbis, when they analyze the Torah, were always trying to be very, very careful to make sure they knew exactly what the Torah was prohibiting, to make sure that we knew what those commandments were directly from the Torah. And that happens to be one of the exceptions. Okay, so in order to avoid the cooking of meat and milk together, the first thing you have to do is not put meat and milk in the same pot. That's obvious, right? But what about if you put them in the same pot? This is where we have to go back to the Torah to understand that according to the Torah, materials, the material of the pot makes a difference. And we know this from the book of Numbers, from Bamidbar, where it says that only the gold, the silver, the copper, the iron, the tin, the lead, by the way, don't cook with lead now, not a good idea. You'll notice all metals in fire, you shall pass through fire, and then it will be clean. By clean, we mean ritually pure, able to be used for kosher food. It must, however, also be cleansed with sprinkling water, and whatever is not used in fire, you shall pass through water. Okay, so this is the general terms that are described in the Torah, from which the rabbis derive the laws of how we know what materials are kosher and what materials can be made kosher, and in particular, how we can deal with it. So there's a basic presumption within the Torah that is implied in this, which is if I get a pot secondhand from my non-Jewish neighbor, and I know that they haven't been eating kosher food because, they're not Jewish. Why would they? If I get the pot from them secondhand with their pot, the presumption from the Torah is no. I can't just take their pot, put it on my stove, and start cooking, because the materials that they have been cooking have become embedded in the walls of the pot, right? They have been absorbed into the pot. And we can, however, for some materials, we can cleanse it. Now, cleansing here doesn't just mean giving it a good, wash. It doesn't mean just giving it a good rub. You have to actually get the material to release what has been absorbed. And that we will go into. Okay, so because different materials, as was implied by the line from Numbers, and some of them are easier to make new again. By make new, it means you return them to a neutral status. If it used to be used for non-kosher food, now it is a blank pot again. If it was used for meat, now it is a blank pot again. If it was used for milk, now it is a blank pot again. If it was used during the rest of the year and you want to use it for Passover, now it is a blank pot again, right? The rules for koshering, that's the verb that we use for making something kosher, are the same for something that was meat and milk, something that was non-kosher, and something that you want to use for Pesach. Very practical if you want to swap your kitchen over during Passover. Okay, so some of them, like clay pots and plates, never. Right? If you have your lovely plate that is like a terracotta plate, or the plate that you made when you were in kindergarten, and you've been using that for your breakfast plate your entire life, that can never be rekoshered. So if someone ever puts a nice hot steaming piece of bacon on that, it is now a treif plate forever.
What if it's never been used that way?
If it's never been used for any food whatsoever, then it is still neutral. But as soon as you put, and we're going to come into this in more detail, as soon as you put hot food on it, it now becomes that, and becomes that forevermore. So clay and plates, which was the most common form of plates for the ancient world, these have a sponge-like quality. You put something on it, it gets sucked into the little holes in the clay, and you're never getting everything out, which means every time it is reheated, every time new hot food is put on it, it's going to release more of what was in there before. So that's why clay pots, plates can never be rekoshered. This used to be an even bigger issue when it came to ovens, which were usually like clay domes that you would cook on the outside of. Now, not such a big problem. Our ovens are a little bit easier to work with. Door lock? Okay. On the other end of materials, we've got glass. Right now, glass is a little controversial in the ancient times, but eventually over the centuries, we have glass, and glass is considered to be the perfect material. Glass does not absorb at all. Yes, I'm going to answer the question in advance because this is the one that everyone always asks. Does that mean I can take a glass plate and serve meat on it, and then I can take the same glass plate and serve, my hot vegetarian lasagna on it? And the answer is technically yes. All right, so let me work you through this, right? So first of all, glass as a rule, if you have glass and it is cross-used, if it is washed and clean and there are nothing left on it in between uses, then yes, technically there has been no violation, there's been no transgression, and everything is squeaky clean. However, for most of the last 2,000 years, people have been very careful to make sure that they are careful about what plate, what pot have they been using. And when we get too accustomed to just using the same one, both meat and dairy, it takes away our carefulness. We are no longer watchful of what we are doing. So if it is important for the family, so for example, when someone comes to me and says, Rabbi, I want to keep kosher, but I don't know that I can afford 2 sets of plates, I say, look, start with glass, right? You start with glass plates and focus on getting pots and pans, because those are going to be metal usually. and build your way up from there. And then eventually get a second plate of a second set of dishes that you're going to only use for meat or only going to use for dairy. Dishes are the nicer dishes. If you're having meat, it's a nice occasion. So technically, yes, but in common practice, it's not usual to see someone only have glass plates. And you'd still have to remember to keep your knives and forks and your serving spoons and your mixing spoons and all of those things, because metal, wood, stone, and heat-resistant plastics can be re-kosher. That is to say, you can use those and swap their identity or fix their identity if they came into contact with something that wasn't kosher. That works.
Fine china.
So fine china, for example, your great-grandmother's beautiful porcelain. No idea whether it was meat or dairy, or maybe you don't even know whether she kept kosher. So if it is something that is intact, meaning there are not scratches and cuts that are through chips that are through the glazing, then what we usually do is you set it aside for 12 months, and after having been washed and thoroughly cleaned and inspected, and then it can be reclaimed. A common occurrence. Okay, we're doing okay on the general idea here. Now we'll get down into rolling up your sleeves and how this works. Before we kosher anything, and remember, koshering can be before Passover if you want to get rid of the chametz, the leavening. Koshering can be because you made a mistake and a meat dish has become was used with dairy by mistake, or maybe you have something from your pre-keeping kosher days that you would like to use now that needs to be koshered. Usually we'll have to go through these basic steps. One, after it's already been used, clean it. Now, I hope you already are cleaning your pots and pans, but it's important to know this, right? So you get it clean. Leave it unused for 24 hours. Now, unused for 24 hours has a practical benefit. It isn't just like, a waiting period. The idea is that anything, let's back up here. The basic principle that the rabbis are concerned with is that when we are told not to cook meat in milk, or not to eat non-kosher food, is that there is a feeling that the kosher food or the mixture we want, something that adds to the flavor. That's why people add ingredients to things, right? No one puts bacon into their, hamburger because they just want to fill in the hamburger. They put it in there because they think it tastes good. If the food is rotten, if the food is no longer fresh or good, then we are not as concerned. 24 hours, then any food that might have been absorbed by the time it comes out is now no longer doing good things, right? It's called a ta'am lifgam. It's a bad flavor that's being added rather than a good flavor that's being added. So by giving it the 24 hours, we can be assured that when we get to the koshering part, the making it kosher, is not beneficial and not something that's going to just mess up the pot or pan. That logic makes sense there? Right? So we're giving 24 hours to let the embedded food spoil so that when we make it spit out from the walls, good food, but it is bad, and therefore when it gets flushed away, it's not leaving behind a good flavor, and we're not going to have to go through this all over again. It's a little hard because nowadays we don't tend to think of our food being absorbed. We don't tend to think of food, rancid and all of that, because we are all so lucky to live in the modern world and usually eat good, healthy, clean food. Not so for most of the last 2,000, 3,000 years. Okay, so we have it left unused for 24 hours. We then have to go through the appropriate form of koshering. It's the appropriate form depending upon how the items get used. And that's what we're going to go through in just a second. If it has never been used with cooked food or with sharp foods are things like onions or very, very spicy food, then it has never absorbed flavors. So to come back to your question, if I have my little clay plate from when I was in kindergarten, I never used it with food at all, or I only ever put, an apple on it kind of thing. Apple, cold plate, it's never absorbed the flavor of the apple or anything else that's on it. So those category of utensils are not an issue. right? Because if you remember way back when we started, too long ago, we said you will not cook the kid in the mother's milk, right? So there needs to be heat involved before the absorption of the flavors takes place. And there needs to be heat involved to release the flavors that were absorbed. Good? All right, so guess what we're going to use to get the flavors out? Heat. Heat in a different set of varieties. So the general rule that is used is kiv'ol o kach polto. Now what that literally means is as it swallows, vomit forth, so will it expel. So it basically means the way it got in is the way it comes out, which also works for when you eat and you get sick, right? It goes down, it comes up. So depending upon the use, that is what we're going to have. So this is from the Talmud where it says, Rav Huna said, Yeshua said, a wooden ladle should be purged in boiling water in a primary vessel. That means in a on the heat right now, right? Not a pot that you filled with hot water, but a pot that is on the fire right now. Because he holds, as it absorbs, so it ejects it. Because after all, how is your spoon coming food? Because you're stirring something on the pot, on the fire. So you put it into a pot on the fire. To clean it, you need to put it into a pot on the fire. You need to subject it to the same type of conditions, and that will get it out. So depending upon how the cooking tool was heated, we then know how to make it kosher. So let's look at the main categories. So the most common type is known as hagala. And hagala is a boiling process, because for most of our food, we are usually working with liquids on a hot surface, our stovetop, and then we are sticking spoons into it and all of that, or we're putting it on plates after we've now served it. Hot, sort of gooey food is coming into contact with all of its nice juices and that sort of thing. That's the main form of cooking for most of the things that we do. To recreate that situation in order to kick it out. So most stovetop pots, you know, your saucepans or your pasta pans or pots, I guess is the right word. Your cooking utensils, your stirring spoons, your tongs, and all those sorts of things. Your knives, your forks, your spoons. This is the way that we kosher them. You take a kosher pot, right, or a new one, and you fill it with water, and you get it right up to a roiling boil, right? Not just a little simmer, but you want the whole bubbles and everything flying through it. You want a really, really good hot pot. And you want it to be up there, and then you can put the item in. It doesn't have to stay in for a long time. You can count to 10 is sort of a good rule of thumb. But as long as it's in there for a little bit, then it has been reheated to the way that it normally is used. Then the bad stuff comes out, or the stuff you want to get rid of, like the chametz, which isn't bad, but we don't want it for Passover, and you're good. Now, if it's too big, like let's say you've got really, really long tongs and you don't have a pot that deep, you can dip half of it in and turn it over and dip the other half in. All right, that's fine. So it doesn't have to be done all at the exact same time. You do need to make sure that you get, and by the way, strongly have to recommend, if you're doing this, wear gloves or some other technique for holding on to the things, because it'll get hot. I have a number of scars from when I've been trying to kosher things, because you're working with hot liquids or hot stoves and ovens and things, and it's easy to burn yourself. So please be careful. So objects that have parts that cannot be reached to be cleaned cannot be kosher. So let's say, for example, you have a toaster, right? And you want to get your toaster kosher because you are coming up to Passover and you want to get it kosher. It's not going to happen, right? Because if your toaster is able to be literally disassembled down to all of its pieces, and then clean all of the little, pieces inside of it, and then kosher all of the pieces inside of it, most of us, we're not taking our toaster apart. Right? Same thing with things like blenders or other types of very, very complicated devices that can't be koshered because you can't get into all of the pieces. This can also be an issue with very old cutting boards or very old spoons or things, that there are cracks and crevices that just go too deep. And there's no way to really get everything out of them. So if you're ever like not sure, you always just ask me and I'll say, yeah, we can kasher that, or no, that one's just going to have to go. Clear on that? Right? So hagalah is one of the most common forms, if not the most common form of kasher. A little bit more direct is what's known as libun. Now, libun comes from the same word as lavan, which means white. And the idea is that you are making something white hot. You are making it glowing hot. For things like baking trays, other things that have been in the fire. Think of like your barbecue, if you want the like best case example. You know, the grill that is actually in the fire coming up out of the charcoal. That we don't just use boiling water, because that wasn't just used with boiling water. Right? That's got fire right on the metal where we are cooking from. So to do this, there's a couple of options. You can do it with a blowtorch, right? Just heat it up until it is, you know, red hot. Very, very careful. Please do not do this without properly reading through the manual, and we can discuss when and where it's needed. But except for grills and roasting spits and that kind of stuff that's really right on the fire, which is the most common case where this is needed, usually what we can do is just crank the heat up about 550 degrees for about an hour, and you're good. And in fact, most ovens that have a self-cleaning cycle, that counts. Again, remember what we said at the beginning. Don't use it for, clean it, don't use it for a day, and then do the kasher. Make sense? Okay. We get to do this every year before Passover. And then we have irui, which is a form of kashering of surfaces that have only perhaps ever had, you know, hot water or things splashed on them. You know, you're taking the sauce off the stove and you put it on your countertop and a little bit of the spaghetti sauce falls over, that kind of thing. Not that you're serving on it, but it's just, you know, it hits. Don't use for 24 hours. And you pour boiling water over the surfaces. This is also very useful for sinks and things like that. Make sense? Yes. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. As you use it, that's how you clean it. Or kasher it. All right. Contamination. Okay. So, first of all, relax. Right. In a kosher kitchen, where you know where things are and you're in charge of the cooking, meat and milk is very, very rare. In my own house for the last 14 years, 15, I'm trying to think, 17 years, we have not had any incidents where the wrong spoon got used or the wrong, you know, ladle was put in the wrong. It is not that common. Kitchens, or when you're panicking and rushing because the guests are going to be here in a minute, that's when mistakes can happen. And we're going to talk about, first of all, what the mistakes are, and also what mistakes are not such a big deal. Because not every mistake is a meltdown. Not every mistake is a catastrophe. So first, we're going to start off with Rambam, because he's good at calm, cool explanations. So it is only when meat and milk become mixed together through cooking that they both become forbidden. Remember, I mentioned that before. You need the heat before the transfer of flavors takes place. When a hot object fell into a hot object, or when a cold object fell into a hot object, right? So I've got my pot of meat stew sitting there on the stove, and I'm walking by with my piece of cheese, because why not? And as I go to bite into my piece of cheese, a piece of cheese falls into the pot. Now we have a potential problem, because the piece of cheese, even though it's cold, is going into the hot cooking substance. And likewise, if I have my piece of cheese sitting on the counter and I pour the hot stew over it, we've got a problem. If, however, what is hot fell into the other when it is cold, right? So I've got I'm trying to think of an example here, my hot piece of meat, and I've got my cold glass of milk, right? Remove the surface of the meat which touched the milk, and the remainder may be eaten. Okay, yeah, I know. Looking at somebody here who has kept kashrut all her life, and that may sound surprising,
Yes.
right? I had my shish kebab, and one of the things of meat went into the milk. You trim off the parts that came into contact with the milk, right? Provided the milk was cold, right? If the milk was also hot, then we have a different issue. What's that?
I'm just saying it's something that reminds me of what happened to us.
Right. Now, in general, this is not the kind of thing that's happening, because most of the time when I'm eating my shish kebab, there's no glasses of milk nearby.
Right.
But for much of our history, people didn't always have the luxury of having such clean and well-ordered and organized kitchens. They usually didn't have a kitchen. You just had a room, and you would cook in the room or cook in the courtyard while you were doing everything else. And you didn't have refrigerators, so you were probably carrying around the milk that you needed for that day at the same time. So there's a reason why this had to be discussed, and there's a reason why most of us never have to even. But it is important to understand the basic ideas. Likewise, Rambam goes on to say, if cold fell into cold, one must wash the piece of meat thoroughly, and it may be eaten. Right? So imagine you were cold salami out of the refrigerator, and you drop it, and it falls right into your cream cheese that was open at the bottom of the fridge. Right? Meat was up here, and you pull it out, and the meat is not gone. Right? You take the meat, you walk over to the sink, and you're good. Right? Now, you also have to make sure that nothing got left behind in the cream cheese and all those issues as well. But it's not an end of the world type of occurrence. On the whole, though, cover your cream cheese. And as Rambam points out, for this reason, it is permitted for meat and milk to be carried together in a single wrap, like in your backpack, if they don't touch each other. And even if they do touch each other, wash the meat and wash the cheese. So if you were packing your food for a long journey, and you're going to have meat one time and you're going to have cheese another time, not at the same time, each other in your backpack, that's okay. You're not going to starve. You just rinse off the meat, rinse off the cheese, and you can still eat them as you need. Good?
So the whole thing is fire then.
Cooking, heat.
Just in general,
Yeah.
Fire is the element that transforms everything.
Because fire is transformative, right? That is one of the miracles of humanity, right? When humanity became humanity, that we learned was how to make fire. Because it changes food chemically, and it changes food as far as how we can eat. Fire is pre-digestion, right? Like flies, how they digest their food by sort of throwing up on it, and then they eat it. That way it digests outside of their body first. Well, fire does that for us. Yeah, I know. It's a lovely thing to think about, but fire and heat allows us to eat food much more efficiently and to get much more benefit from the food than if we didn't have fire. Look at evolution and all of that. You can see when we discovered fire, things begin to change, our brains start taking off, and all of a sudden the world becomes open to us because fire changes us absolutely. Okay, so fire is transformative. So do a couple little examples. Accidental uses or splashes can happen even when you're being careful, but most are not the end of the world, as we said. So for example, stirred with a dairy spoon that hadn't been used in the last 24 hours, right? So you got a spoon that you used 2 days ago, and you accidentally pick it up, eat stew. The spoon needs to be kashered, right? So you're going to have to go to the Hagalah. You're going to have to boil up a pot of water and dip the spoon in the water and all of that, like we talked about, after waiting 24 hours and having cleaned it and all of that. The stew itself, right? You can still eat that stew for dinner that night. However, meat stew stirred with a dairy spoon used recently, right? That was the spoon you used when you were cooking breakfast for mixing your cheesy omelets. I don't know. So it's been used within the same 24-hour period. If the part that you dipped into the stew, then 1/60th of the stew, this is what's known as batel b'shishin, which means if it's less than a fraction of 1/60th the volume of what is going into, like you put it in and you go, or let's imagine, you got a big stew pot and you got a small spoon, right? If could I put 60 of my spoons in this pot? If the answer is yes, it's okay. The spoon still has to be kashered, but the stew is okay. On the other hand, if it was a tiny little, meat pot that you were stirring up and then you went, then no. Then the stew is done. You have to throw that out, and both the pot have to be kosher. Making sense? So this is a very important point, that when we make a mistake, there is still leniency for if it is less than 1/60th, because if it's less than 1/60th, it will not impart a flavor to what it is that we are cooking. In the classical text, when it talks about this, the rule of thumb is actually even more lenient than this, which is you have a non-Jew taste it. And if they can taste the meat that has been mixed in, then you have to get rid of it. But as a rule of thumb, we don't go around asking our neighbors who aren't Jewish, can you taste any meat in there? So that as the minimum measure that we could reliably say, less than 1/60th, and it doesn't matter for the flavor. The other thing that people often want to know about, and rightly so, is how long do I have to wait between eating meat and eating milk? Because I know I can't cook them together. I know I can't eat them together. But what about separately? Is there any separation that I need to be concerned about? From the Talmud, Rav Chisda said, one who eats meat isn't allowed to eat cheese, meaning any dairy products. One who eats cheese is allowed to eat meat, right? So again, not at the same time, but soon afterwards, if you eat cheese, soon afterwards you can eat meat, right? And the opposite is not true. If you eat meat, you cannot soon after expect to eat cheese. That is, right? Because Rav Acha Bar Yosef said to Rav Chisda that the meat, this is between the teeth. So what do we make of it? Why are we talking about the meat between the teeth? Because we're talking about the verse from Numbers where it says the meat was still between their teeth. This is from the story of the quail, when the people are gagging on all the meat that they've been begging Moshe for. So the issue here about the separation of time is nothing to do with our stomach. It is everything to do with our dentistry. That when you eat meat, you are very, 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 very likely to get bits of meat stuck between your teeth, because meat is stringy. That's what meat is. Not so much. And most cheeses, not so much. If you eat cheese that does get stuck in your teeth, you do have to get rid of it before you have your meat. Products are not teeth clinging, but most meat products are. Or the issue is, do you still have meat in your teeth? So you know the old thing, is there something in my teeth? That's what we're worried about here, because then you are eating meat and milk together. They are in your mouth together. We don't care if they're in your stomach together, mouth together. Is that clear? Yeah?
It's so different. I know from Germany, it was like 3 hours after me.
We're getting to that.
6 hours. Good. Okay. Because my parents Poland. 6 hours I gotta wait.
Okay. So second half of the Talmud section here is where we're going to get to timing. Right. So Mar Ukva says, in comparison to my father regarding this matter, I am vinegar, son of wine. What that basically means is my father was amazing, me, not so much. Right? Because my father, when he ate meat, he would not eat cheese until the same time the next day. He would wait a whole 24 hours just to be careful, just to be sure that there was nothing left in his mouth. But I, even if I won't eat at this meal, right, I'm not going to eat, of course, at the same meal. I'll eat in the next meal. Right? So this became the benchmark that from Mar Ukva's story, which is I'm not going to eat meat and milk at the same meal, but I will eat milk after meat at the next meal. How long till the next meal?
Yeah. Depends what country you came from.
Oh, and it depends what you mean by meal, right? So many countries, many communities established it as being morning meal to evening meal, which was the standard 2 meals that most people had, because most people didn't have 3 meals a day, they had 2. And that was about a 6-hour period. And that's where the waiting 6 hours came from. In other countries, they had different standards. So we read in Yoredea from Shulchan Aruch. This is actually from the Ramah, which was the actually Polish authority in the Shulchan Aruch. And he says, from Joseph Caro, they said 6 hours, done. But the Ramah explains it this way. There are those that says that he doesn't have to wait 6 hours, but rather immediately, if he finishes the meal and says the concluding blessing, after wiping and rinsing his mouth. Wiping meaning the inside, right? Not just your lips, but making sure your teeth are clean. The Talmud actually describes this very clearly with hard bread, so that it scrapes your teeth. They didn't have toothbrushes back then, so this was the best they could do. The simple custom in our countries, and he's talking about Poland at this time, eating meat 1 hour and to eat cheese afterwards. But you have to say the concluding blessing after the meal, after the meat, because then it's like a new meal. A new meal? What counts as a new meal is if I've said the blessing, I finish the meal. And now I have to say a new blessing. I'm starting a new meal. Usually you could eat very, very soon after the meat meal, but the custom was to wait at least an hour as a cushion between those two meals, rather than saying the Birkat Hamazon, cleaning out the ice cream and saying Shehakol, the blessing for the new meal of ice cream. That technically might be permissible, but that's really pushing it, right? Because most people do not have meals within 5 minutes of each other. But having a snack an hour after you ate, that's not impossible. That's conceivable. And so the custom was to wait an hour. However, of course, at all times, if he finds meat between his teeth after the hour, he has to pull it out. Right? If you can still feel the bits of meat left in your mouth, it doesn't matter whether you've waited 1 hour, 3 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours, the meat has to come before you actually eat the new food, the dairy food. Make sense? Okay, so this is where we end up with the variety of wait times. It's a much longer story to figure out where the 3-hour wait time came from. That's a possible error of the copy editors as they were copying over books.
I also was you had lunch, and then in Germany, then they had a mid-afternoon.
Right, and it is the German tradition that is that has the 3 hour as the predominant.
Meat and half an hour after cheese. We had to wait 1 hour after cheese
and
6 hours after meat.
Right, and as you can see, that was what the Sephardim did. But that was not originally what the Ashkenazim did. The original method of the Ashkenazim was one. Now, to this day, the Dutch custom is to wait 1 hour. They have that custom. So, but the important part is nothing in your mouth. So, just as a few more things to see that this has been a long-running discussion and there have been a variety of opinions. At the next meal I'll eat. This is the quote from Mar Ukva that we just saw. Not just at the meal that is customary, meaning one of the fixed meals, the morning and then the one in the evening, but rather even immediately if you clear the table and make the concluding blessing. It is permissible, since the rabbis didn't differentiate. So this is from the Tosafot. The Tosafot are, next to Rashi, the most famous commentators on the Talmud, from the Middle Ages in France primarily. And they said, yeah, that is the halacha. Now, most of them still wait, but they want to know what is the halacha and what is it the custom that people do. So the custom is to wait, but yes, technically this is the limit. And the Tur, which was even earlier than Shulchan Aruch, it's actually the book that the Shulchan Aruch was based on, quotes the Bahag, another commentator from the 9th century, that one who eats meat can eat dairy immediately after, as long as there is wiping and washing of the hands. You got all the residue of the meat gone. You're not worried about any mixing, because after all, your hands, these are not hot implements. You're not cooking with your fingers. At least I hope not. So you are in good shape. Okay. Meat and milk, we're done. On to Gid HaNashe, or the sciatic nerve. This is another element that you never have to worry about unless you plan to become a butcher. But it is still important to know, because you should know the rules of Kashrut. So in the book of Genesis, we have a very famous scene where Jacob wrestles and gets into a fight before he meets his brother Esau the next day. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he wrenched Jacob's hip at the socket, so that the socket of his hip was strained as he wrestled with him. And then at the end of that section, it says, that is why the children of Israel to this day do not eat the thigh muscle. The Gid HaNashe is the better translation. That is on the socket of the hip, since Jacob's hip socket was wrenched at the thigh muscle. So the Gid HaNashe, we call it in English, the sciatic nerve. And there is a whole cluster of nerves that go down your thigh. Maybe you've ever met someone who has sciatica, right? And it's a very painful condition in the hips where they limp, very much like Jacob would have limped. And because of this, and because God commanded it, not just to remember it, but because it's a mitzvah, we don't eat that tissue. So butcher will take and cut around that and remove all of those pieces. And the halakha is very clear about how to remove and what to remove and how much to remove and on all of that, so that we don't eat it. Unless you're killing your own cows, the meat that you buy at the supermarket, this has already been taken care of. So it's not something that you need to do for yourself. However, when you are keeping the mitzvah, Sefer HaChinuch, wonderful book, gives an explanation of what you should be thinking about as you keep this mitzvah. So it's a little bit long, bear with me, but it's just a beautiful way of how what looks like a very simple mitzvah can have many layers of meaning. From the roots of this mitzvah are to serve as an indication to Israel that though they will suffer many oppressions in the exile by the nations and the descendants of Esau, because we saw Esau as being Rome and as being the other empires that came after, they should trust that they will not perish, right? Jacob wrestled with Esau, and ultimately, even though he suffered, even though he had this pain, he still was able to win. But rather that their descendants and name will stand firm forever, and that their Redeemer will come and redeem them from their oppressor. And in continually remembering this idea through the commandment that serves as a reminder, meaning the commandment not to eat this portion, they will stand firm in their faith and righteousness forever. Right? It reinforces our faith that one day there will be a full redemption and we won't be limping. We won't have this kind of problem. And this indication stems from the fact that the angel who fought with Yaakov, our forefather, our ancestor, who according to a tradition was the guardian angel of Esau, wished to eliminate Yaakov from the world and his descendants, but he could not get the better of him. So the Midrash says that this angel that he's fighting is Esau's angel. So Esau versus Israel is a metaphor for the material, the coarse, the crass, the militaristic world trying to crush the spiritual world of Jacob, of Israel. And they tried, but they failed. Israel was still there. Jacob still survived. Therefore, he anguished him, he hurt him and injured his thigh. And likewise, Esau's descendants anguish Yaakov's descendants. But in the end, we, the latter, we will be saved from them. As we find in Genesis, in the same passage, with respect to our ancestor, that the sun shone to heal him and he was saved from pain. Because the line that comes right after the fight is the sun rises and he goes out to meet Esau. So will the Son of the Messiah shine, and he will heal us from our pain and redeem us speedily in our days. Amen. Right. So what looks like just a almost trivial thing, by remembering that when we eat kosher meat, that it has had this part removed, finding ourselves, and we are adding to our hope that so too will the suffering be removed, hopefully soon, that the sun will shine and the world will be redeemed. So there are many, many layers of meaning in all of this. But again, you're not a butcher, you won't ever have to get the knife. So, oh, that still says Gid Hanashe. See, I needed to edit. So forbidden fats is not Gid Hanashe, but it says in Leviticus, speak to the Israelite people thus, you shall eat no fat of ox or sheep or goat. Now, you might think no fat means like all of your meat has to be super lean. Either type of fat. That there are, you guys know how like they say that the Eskimos have a bunch of different words for snow, right? We have different words for different types of fat. It's almost like a doctor would have, but we would use it because fat was very important in the ancient world, because some fat was very important for cooking, some fat was very important for crafts, some fat was very important for lighting or other forms of energy, and some fat we didn't touch. Why? Because fat from animals that died or were torn by beasts may be put to use, but you must not eat it. And if anyone eats the fat of animals from which offerings by fire may be made to the Lord, the person who eats it shall be cut off, kare. Portion of the fat on the animal, along the belly side, a thick layer of fat, that was used for the altar, that was used for special sacrifices. And that is not for us to eat, right? That was only for the altar. So we have to remove that fat, and we're not allowed to eat it. Which again, if you're a butcher, very, very important to know which pieces of fat would be removed. For us, it's already been removed by the time you buy your kosher food at the supermarket. Now, when I say it's been removed, this is going to bring us to the cow. So ignore the phrase non-kosher. The best picture I could find, but it's labeled a little misleadingly. For much of European history, because of the issues of the sciatic nerve, and because of the issues of the chelev, of the fat along the belly and the other parts of the organs, it was easier to kill the cow, kosher slaughter like we talked about last week, and cut the cow in half and sell the back of the cow to the non-Jewish neighbors and keep the front of the cow for the Jewish customers. That was the easiest thing to do. However, in other places, like most of the Sephardic world, and even still now in Israel, where you don't have just cows growing on trees, where you want to make sure you can use all the cow and you don't have anyone else to sell the back to, then the butcher takes the time to trim out the sciatic nerve and remove the fat, and then you can eat all of it. So, practical impact. Living here in the United States, where we've got lots of people who will buy the back of the cow, and therefore most of the kosher butchers don't bother with the back of the cow, you are not going to find kosher sirloin steak. You're not going to find kosher rump roast, right? It could be, right? They all exist. It is possible, but you would have to get to a special butcher who was willing to deal with those parts of the cow, and it would be more expensive than even regular kosher meat is, in order to get that. You're going to find the meat from the front of the cow much more common as part of a kosher supermarket. So, in case you ever wondered why you don't see those sections, it's just economically easier to sell them off rather than to prepare them properly.
Consider the non-kosher part?
No, the tail can absolutely be kosher. You kill the cow properly and you drain the blood and do everything else properly, you can eat almost all of this.
Okay.
But you got to find a butcher who's willing to do that. And that's where it's a problem, because nowadays the butcher doesn't live next door. Nowadays the cow didn't grow up down the street. Nowadays the cow grew up in Iowa. And that means they're making all the decisions about which parts to keep and which parts to sell in Iowa. And we are able to go to the supermarket and only buy what they gave us. So that limits our options. But yes, it can all be kosher. That's why I don't like the phrase non-kosher. It's more like how to be sold as kosher. It would be a better description. But I didn't have time to edit the picture, and it did everything else that I needed.
And then all of the organs are not kosher.
No, the organs are kosher.
So inside, you could eat those things without an issue.
Absolutely. Chopped liver is a very popular Jewish. I don't like it personally either. My wife loves it, but chopped liver is a very popular kosher food. In fact, it's a good example. If you remember last week, we talked about preparing the meat by removing the blood. Well, if you know what the liver does, the liver cleans the blood. It's not the kind of thing that washing and salting is going to get rid of all the blood. And that's why liver has to be broiled. It has to be heated over a hot fire, and the blood bubbles out from the heat. That's the only way to eat liver and have it be kosher. But the other organs, yeah, you can have kosher sausage made in the intestinals and all that. You can do all of that.
So this is just on the outside. This is just the meat part of it, but the organs, wherever they are.
The organs, wherever they are, if the animal was killed and everything else prepared kosher, the organs can be kosher. You can have kosher tongue. My daughter loves kosher tongue for sandwiches. You can have kosher brains. I heard some people like that. So yeah, the organs are definitely all possible. Some of them, like liver, have to be prepared specially to get rid of the blood. But yes, the others are definitely used, can be used. Nowadays, we tend to go straight for the meat and only the meat. But it doesn't have to be that way.
Any animal, it doesn't matter who raised it, could be kosher, right?
As long as it's alive,
As long as it's alive.
it can still become kosher,
And
yes.
it's killed with the bride.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
So if you were to go to your non-Jewish neighbor and buy his cow, that cow can become kosher, as long as it's still alive, right? Once it's dead, to have been properly slaughtered, it had to be properly prepared and all the other things. But while it's still walking and talking,
It's just a cow.
it's just a cow. It's just a cow. Yeah, so you can buy live chickens, you can buy live sheep, and all those things. It's only once the preparation kicks in that now, from the moment the knife hits it, it has to be done just right.
See, and this talk is never about chicken. You're not.
Well,
I mean, I know
chicken's
this-
not as complicated, right? So we don't have to worry about the gita nashi. We don't have to worry about the sadic
Can't
nerve.
even mention
We don't have to worry about the fat on the belly of the chickens. And that means that chickens or poultry in general, are much easier to prepare. The slaughter was something that was much easier. Many people used to do chickens for themselves at their own home. They didn't need to take it to the butcher. So yeah, poultry was always the easier food than the lamb and the goats and the cows. So that's why when it gets complicated, this is why we put up a picture of a cow.
The eggs. What is the distinction between a kosher and non-kosher egg?
There is no distinction between a non-kosher and kosher egg as long as it comes from a kosher animal. So you don't want to be, eating eagle eggs. Probably not a good idea generally. Maybe they are endangered species. I don't know. But duck eggs and chicken eggs and those things are just fine.
Neighbor has a
Yep.
chicken and give the eggs.
Be very glad. However, there is one issue that we didn't really cover, which is if you're buying eggs that come from a farm with a rooster. That is to say that there's actually a chance for the rooster and the hen to do what the birds do.
Okay.
Then when you crack the eggs open, you have to check for blood.
For the blood.
Right. If you're buying them from a farm without a rooster, which is what most big factory egg farms are like, then you don't need to worry about that checking because there's no chance for fertilization and there's no chance for it to be blood.
Okay.
And the egg is not considered an animal.
Nope. The
right?
egg
It's
is
just
parv.
with
Right.
your dairy.
Right? Egg is like an apple, right? So you can eat it with dairy or you can eat it with meat and
As
no
long as
problem.
it doesn't have blood.
Well, because you're going to be cracking it, usually what we do is we crack it into a glass, right? You check. If they rooster eggs, then you dip it out and you crack a new one. But once you throw it into the pot, you're fine. Okay. One last little tidbit. It's called a hechsher, right? Because it's a little complicated, and because most of us don't know our butcher, we don't know our grocer, we don't know the guy that's selling us the food, we now rely on other people who have done inspections to make sure that what we're buying is kosher. You'll see symbols stamped on packages. That way you know that a group has actually taken the time to investigate and figure out whether or not this food is kosher. They've done the inspections, they've done the review, they've looked through the ingredients, they've watched how they prepare it, on the fact that this food is kosher. So because of how complicated modern food processing is, we need these unless we're eating fruits and vegetables kind of thing, or something that we catch ourselves. Catch a fish, you don't need to look for a stamp. But if you go to buy a piece of meat or kosher salami, which could be kosher style salami, for a stamp that says, yes, this has been inspected and reviewed by an appropriate agency. And this is not all of them. There's different ones all over the country. This one, for example, is in California. The London Beit Din one down here is in London. There are ones all over the place. I think that's Wisconsin, if I'm not mistaken, from my American geography. The ones you'll see most often are OU, the Circle K, the Triangle K, the Kaf K, the CRC. Those are the most common ones that you'll see on most products. One not listed here is also Triangle K, which is acceptable. And that should cover most. That's Australia. I've never actually seen that one in real life.
It was just in Canada too.
Right. Of course. Because for small groups that were doing their own local production, they don't necessarily want to bring in the Orthodox Union to inspect. They can just find a local rabbi who can come and do the inspection. So that's why you end up with regional Beit Dins or regional councils, VADs, that do this inspection. And if you ever have a question of, Rabbi, is this kosher? That's why God invented cell phones. So you can text me with a picture and I'll be happy to give you a response. Yeah, it's like I can be there in the supermarket with you. All right, that finishes Kashrut. Thank you very much. Finishes, that begins Kashrut, but it should at least give you a good framework.